The train pulled into the small alpine station with a low, melodic whistle, the sound echoing into the vast expanse of whiteness surrounding the village. Jenna leaned closer to the frost-lined window, her breath fogging up the glass as the scenery came into view. Pristine snow blanketed the world outside, draping the jagged peaks, the rooftops of timber-framed cottages, and the narrow streets that curved like rivers through the heart of the village. The air seemed to hum with a quiet promise, the kind of stillness that hinted at secrets buried deep beneath the surface. She tightened her scarf, her heart a steady rhythm of anticipation. As she stepped off the train and onto the platform, the cold air hit her cheeks, sharp but invigorating. A group of villagers stood at the station entrance, their faces ruddy from the chill, and their smiles warm enough to melt even the thickest frost. One of them, a middle-aged man in a thick wool coat, stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "You must be Jenna." His voice was rich and welcoming, like the crackle of a fire on a winter night. "I'm Ernst. We've been expecting you." She shook his hand firmly. "It's beautiful here," she said, her gaze drifting to the peaks in the distance. The sun, pale and golden, reflected off the snow, making the whole landscape shimmer. "It is," Ernst agreed, his smile fading slightly. "Which is why your work here is so important." Jenna nodded, sensing the weight behind his words. She didn't need reminding of why the council had sent her to this isolated village, tucked away in the mountains. The proposed development project, new ski resorts, luxury chalets, and a sprawling network of roads promised economic growth but threatened to upend the fragile ecosystem and the village's unique character. Her job was to mediate, to find a path forward that wouldn't tear the community apart. As Ernst led her through the village, Jenna absorbed every detail: the crunch of her boots on the snow, the faint smell of wood smoke, the chatter of children building snow forts in the square. She could feel the pulse of the place, the deep connection the villagers had to their home. It wasn't just a quaint ski village. It was a way of life that had endured for generations. They stopped at a small cafe, its windows fogged up from the warmth inside. Over steaming cups of dark coffee, Ernst began to explain the situation in more detail. The village was divided. Some, eager for the promise of prosperity, supported the development project. Others, fiercely protective of the land and wary of outside interference, resisted it at every turn. Tempers were flaring, and the council was desperate to avoid a rift that might never heal. "I won't sugarcoat it," Ernst said, his hands wrapped around his mug. "The stakes are high, and you'll have to tread carefully. This isn't just about economics. It's about identity, history, and trust." Jenna listened intently, her mind already turning over ideas. She'd handled delicate negotiations before, but something about this felt different. The stakes weren't just political, they were deeply personal. And for the first time in a long while, she felt the stirrings of uncertainty. Could she really mediate a solution without damaging what made this place so special? As they left the cafe, Jenna paused on the steps, looking out over the village. Snowflakes had begun to fall, soft and unhurried, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. She pulled her coat tighter and squared her shoulders. This wasn't just another assignment. This was a chance to prove, to the council, to the villagers, to herself, that progress and preservation could coexist. But as she followed Ernst to the council hall, she couldn't shake the feeling that the path ahead would be far from simple. The wind howled through the pines as Alex knelt in the snow, his gloved hands carefully brushing aside the powder to reveal the ground beneath. He adjusted his headlamp, the pale beam cutting through the early morning gloom, and leaned closer to examine the frozen soil. Most people would have seen nothing more than an unremarkable patch of earth, but Alex saw a story, a disruption subtle but telling. He reached for his field notebook, perched precariously on a nearby rock, and scribbled a quick note in his precise, angular handwriting. Soil compaction inconsistent, possible recent equipment tracks. Follow up. The pen's ink stuttered in the cold, but he pressed on undeterred. Around him, the forest seemed to hold its breath, the only sounds the faint creak of trees swaying in the wind and the distant crackle of ice shifting on the nearby stream. Alex straightened, his breath clouding in the icy air, and scanned the landscape. The forest here was ancient, its towering trees standing like sentinels, their branches weighed down by snow. A place like this didn't just change overnight, not without reason. And yet, over the past few months, he had documented subtle but undeniable shifts. Unexplained die-offs of smaller flora, a decline in water quality, and now these mysterious disturbances in the soil. Something was happening, and he was determined to find out what, no matter how many raised eyebrows his methods earned him. Still poking around in the dirt, I see. The voice startled him, and he turned sharply to see a man in his 50s leaning against a tree, his arms crossed. It was Dieter, the owner of the village hardware store and an unofficial mouthpiece for the locals. Alex exhaled slowly, adjusting his scarf. "Good morning, Dieter," Alex replied evenly, tucking the notebook into his coat pocket. "What can I do for you?" Dieter shrugged, his tone carrying an edge of derision. "Just curious. Most people would have written their report and gone home by now, but not you. You're out here at dawn, wandering around like some kind of ghost." "I'm thorough," Alex said simply, brushing stray snow from his knees. He didn't bother explaining further. He'd learned early on that detailed answers only invited more skepticism. Dieter stepped closer, his boots crunching loudly in the snow. "Thorough, sure, but you're not exactly endearing yourself to the folks around here, you know. People notice when someone spends more time talking to trees than to them." Alex paused, meeting the man's gaze. "I'm not here to make friends, Dieter. I'm here to figure out what's happening to this land before it's too late." Dieter snorted, shaking his head. "You keep saying that, but half the people in this village think you're just trying to stir up trouble. Maybe even sabotage the development project." Alex's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. He wasn't surprised. He'd heard the whispers at the market, seen the sideways glances when he walked through the square. He was used to being an outsider. It was easier that way. "I'm not against progress," Alex said finally, his voice low but firm. "But progress without understanding, without responsibility, leads to ruin. If that makes me unpopular, so be it." Dieter studied him for a long moment, then shrugged again. "Suit yourself, scientist. Just don't expect us to roll out the welcome mat while you keep poking holes in the ground." With that, he turned and trudged off, leaving Alex alone once more. For a moment, Alex watched him go, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to his work, pulling a small sample vial from his bag. He crouched again, carefully scooping soil into the container before sealing it tight. The answers were here, somewhere beneath the ice and snow. He just had to keep looking, no matter how cold the air or how distant the villagers' warmth. The small community hall buzzed with quiet anticipation as villagers shuffled into their seats, the scent of pine wood and fresh snow lingering in the air. Jenna sat toward the back, her notebook balanced on her knee, scanning the room. The walls were bare except for faded posters of past winter festivals, and the only decoration on the stage was a whiteboard covered in hastily scribbled notes. At the front, a local environmental expert tried to rally the group with an impassioned monologue about sustainability, though his words seemed to hang awkwardly in the chilly air. Jenna's gaze slid to the man sitting a few rows ahead of her. He wasn't like the others, his posture rigid, his head cocked slightly, as though he were dissecting the speaker's argument in real time. His dark hair was mussed, his scarf wound haphazardly around his neck, and when he tilted his head to jot something in the margins of a well-worn notebook, Jenna caught sight of his glasses slipping down his nose. He murmured something under his breath, inaudible from where she sat, but his body language radiated sharp focus. "And while the proposed resort could bring revenue," the speaker at the front continued, "we must ask whether the cost to our natural surroundings is one we're willing to bear." Jenna leaned back in her chair, preparing her own thoughts to contribute to the debate, but the man in front of her shot his hand up first. His voice, low and deliberate, carried easily across the room. "You've mentioned revenue projections 5 times in this presentation," he said, standing. "But what about the long-term ecological impact? Has anyone considered what this could do to our water supply in 20, 30 years? A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Jenna's eyebrows lifted slightly. The man hadn't introduced himself, but there was no hesitation in his tone. He stood like someone who was used to defending his ideas, even if the room wasn't on his side. The speaker faltered. Well, we haven't run those projections yet, but... Then how do you propose the council make an informed decision if you're ignoring half the equation? He pressed, his voice sharp but not unkind. Jenna couldn't help herself. She raised her hand, cutting in smoothly. To be fair, she said, her voice carrying a balance of challenge and diplomacy. Long-term projections are crucial, but they're only as useful as the models we base them on. Has anyone looked into how climate variability could factor into those forecasts? Every head turned toward her. The man in the scarf glanced back, his eyes narrowing, and for a moment their gazes locked. He adjusted his glasses and tilted his head slightly as if reevaluating her. The speaker stammered, I'm not sure we've accounted for that either. A faint, knowing smile ghosted across the man's face as he turned fully to Jenna. It seems you've thought this through, he said, his tone carrying a subtle note of challenge. But if you're talking about climate models, you'll also need baseline data. Do you have any? Jenna didn't miss a beat. No, but I imagine someone who spends their mornings out in the snow might. A few chuckles rose from the crowd. The man's expression softened, amusement flickering in his eyes. Touché. The conversation moved on, but Jenna felt the weight of his attention for the rest of the workshop. When the meeting adjourned, the two found themselves lingering by the steaming coffee urns in the corner. He extended a gloved hand. Alex, he said simply. Jenna, she replied, shaking his hand. Here to stir up trouble? Only if pointing out flaws counts as stirring, he said, smirking. And you? I prefer to call it finding solutions, she countered, matching his energy. For the first time in days, Jenna felt a spark of curiosity, not about the village's conflicts, but about the man in front of her. The council chamber was colder than Jenna expected, despite the fire crackling in the stone hearth near the front. She tugged her scarf tighter around her neck, her breath curling faintly in the chilly air as she resisted the urge to tap her pen against her notebook. Across the room, Alex leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, his scarf once again haphazardly wrapped around him, like an afterthought. He hadn't said a word since the meeting began, opting instead to observe, his sharp gaze flicking between the council members as they deliberated. Given the complexity of the situation, Ernst said, his deep voice carrying above the murmurs of the council, it's clear we need a thorough impact study to present before the final vote. And after this morning's workshop, it's just as clear that you two, he gestured toward Jenna and Alex, are the most qualified to lead it. Jenna blinked, her pen stilling midair. Us? She asked, her tone carefully measured. Alex's eyes narrowed slightly, his posture stiffening. I work alone, he said evenly, his voice calm but firm. And I'm here to mediate, not conduct studies, Jenna added, glancing at Alex briefly before addressing Ernst. Ernst leaned forward in his chair, his weathered hands folded on the table. You're both here for the same reason, to help this village figure out the right path forward. Your skills complement each other. Jenna, you understand the political and social nuances. Alex, you have the scientific expertise we need. This isn't about what's comfortable. It's about what's necessary. Alex exhaled quietly through his nose, shifting his weight. With all due respect, I don't think... Ernst cut him off, his gaze firm but not unkind. You don't have to like it, but you do have to try, for the sake of the village. The silence that followed was heavy. Jenna glanced at Alex again, noting the set of his jaw, the way his fingers clenched the strap of his bag. She understood his resistance. Collaboration could be messy, unpredictable, but the council's decision was final. They both knew it. Fine, Alex said finally, his tone clipped. But don't expect miracles. Jenna offered a tight smile, masking her own uncertainty. We'll do our best. Later that afternoon, they stood outside the council hall, the snow falling softly around them. The air between them felt charged, not with anger, exactly, but with something unspoken and uneasy. So, Jenna began, tucking a strand of hair beneath her hat, where do we start? Alex adjusted his glasses, avoiding her gaze. I've already been collecting data on soil conditions, water quality, and vegetation changes. I'll handle the technical aspects. You can focus on whatever it is you do. Jenna raised an eyebrow, biting back a retort. Right? Because understanding how to present the data to the people who actually make decisions isn't important. He glanced at her then, his expression unreadable. I didn't mean it like that. Of course you didn't, she replied smoothly, though her tone carried a hint of sarcasm. They walked in awkward silence for a moment, boots crunching against the snow-covered path. Finally, Alex spoke, his voice quieter this time. We're not going to get anywhere if this is how it's going to be, he said. Let's just divide the work and keep it professional. Jenna nodded, drawing a deep breath. Agreed, but I'd suggest we actually talk through our findings regularly, so we're not working at cross purposes. He hesitated, then gave a small nod. Fair. It wasn't exactly a truce, but it was a start. As they headed toward the village square, Jenna couldn't help but think that navigating the challenges of the study might be easier than navigating the man walking beside her. But then again, she'd faced tougher challenges before. The snow crunched beneath their boots as Jenna and Alex trudged up the narrow mountain trail, their breath visible in the cold air. The late morning sun peeked through the canopy of evergreens, casting dappled light on the path. Jenna tightened her scarf, the warmth of her coat doing little to block the sharp chill that seemed to seep into her bones. She glanced sideways at Alex, who moved with a quiet efficiency, his bag strapped tightly to his back and a handheld GPS device clutched in one gloved hand. This way, Alex murmured, pointing toward a faintly worn path that veered to the left. His voice was calm, detached, like he was narrating for an invisible audience rather than trying to guide her. Jenna sighed but followed his lead, stepping carefully over a patch of ice that glistened treacherously in the sunlight. You know, she said, breaking the silence, you could give a little more warning before switching directions. Some of us don't have an innate sense of mountain trails. Alex glanced back at her, a flicker of something, amusement, maybe, crossing his face. I assumed you could keep up. Assuming tends to get people into trouble, Jenna quipped, but her tone was light, teasing. She adjusted the strap of her bag and quickened her pace to match his. They continued in silence for a while, the only sounds the rustling of wind through the trees and the faint trickle of a nearby stream. Jenna tried to focus on the task at hand, gathering observations on the environmental impact of the proposed development, but her mind kept drifting to the man walking beside her. Alex was an enigma, a mix of precision and aloofness that she couldn't quite decipher. He wasn't unfriendly exactly, but he wasn't making this partnership easy either. At last, they emerged from the dense forest into a clearing. A wide expanse of untouched snow stretched before them, broken only by the jagged edge of a frozen creek. Alex stopped abruptly, pulling a small notebook from his coat and kneeling to examine the icy ground. Jenna hovered nearby, watching as he scraped a thin layer of snow away with the edge of his glove. This area's been disturbed recently, he said, more to himself than to her. See the way the snow's packed unevenly here? And the edge of the creek, it's been disrupted. Jenna squinted, trying to see what he saw. To her, it looked like snow and ice. Still, she crouched beside him, curiosity getting the better of her. What do you think caused it? Alex hesitated, his gaze fixed on the ground. Could be anything. Equipment tracks, maybe, or runoff from upstream. I'll need samples to know for sure. He opened his bag and began pulling out small vials and tools with practiced efficiency. Jenna stood, brushing snow from her gloves. Meanwhile, I'll go talk to the villagers near the square, see if they've noticed anything unusual in this area. Alex glanced up at her, his brow furrowed. You're leaving now? Unless you need me to hold a test tube, she replied with a half-smile. He shook his head. Fine, but be careful. Not everyone's going to appreciate what we're doing out here. Jenna raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. She turned and headed back toward the trail, leaving Alex to his work. By the time Jenna returned to the clearing 30 minutes later, she was flushed from the exercise and the sharpness of her conversations. She found Alex exactly where she'd left him, now crouched near the creek with a sample vial in hand. Well, he asked without looking up. A lot of skepticism, as expected, Jenna admitted, dropping her bag onto the snow. But one of the older villagers, Helga, I think her name was, said her water's been tasting off lately. She wondered if it was something to do with the shifting snowpack. Alex nodded, slipping the vial into his bag. That lines up. Melt patterns from disturbed terrain could affect water quality. He stood, brushing snow from his knees, and glanced at her. Did you convince anyone we're not here to ruin their lives? Jenna smirked. I think Helga likes me now. The others, let's just say they'll warm up when we have answers. For the first time, Alex's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. You're good with people. And you're good with dirt, Jenna replied, her tone playful. I guess that's why they paired us up. Alex gave a faint chuckle, a sound so rare it caught her off guard. That must be it. For a moment, the air between them felt lighter, the tension that had hovered since their first meeting beginning to ebb. Jenna adjusted her scarf, a small smile tugging at her lips. Ready to head back? She asked. Alex nodded, falling into step beside her as they retraced their path through the snow. The silence between them this time wasn't uneasy. It was companionable, the kind that comes from a shared purpose and the first sparks of understanding. The cabin was quiet, except for the rhythmic scratching of pens against paper and the occasional rustle of maps being shifted across the table. A single lamp burned on the desk between them, its warm glow cutting through the darkness outside. Snow tapped gently against the window, carried by a restless wind that howled faintly in the distance. Inside, the air was thick with concentration, the kind of silence that stretched taut but wasn't uncomfortable. Jenna sat cross-legged on the worn sofa, her notebook balanced on her knee. Her pen hovered in mid-air as she glanced over at Alex, who was hunched over a spreadsheet, his glasses slipping down his nose again. He muttered something unintelligible under his breath, absently tucking a pencil behind his ear as he cross-referenced data with a stack of notes beside him. Do you always talk to yourself while you work? Jenna asked, breaking the quiet. Alex paused, looking up at her with an almost startled expression, as if he'd forgotten she was there. Only when I'm arguing with my own calculations, he said, deadpan, before returning his attention to the spreadsheet. Jenna grinned and leaned back against the cushions. You know, most people would find that slightly concerning. Most people don't understand the importance of self-doubt, he replied without missing a beat. She laughed, a soft, genuine sound that filled the room and seemed to surprise him. Alex glanced up again, his lips quirking slightly. What's so funny? Nothing, Jenna said, shaking her head. I just didn't peg you as the type to admit to self-doubt. You always seem so precise, like you've already figured out the answer before anyone else has even thought to ask the question. Alex leaned back in his chair, tipping his head to one side. Trust me, precision comes from questioning everything. And everyone, frankly. Jenna arched an eyebrow. Even me? Especially you, Alex said with a faint smirk. You're too good at smoothing things over. It's suspicious. She laughed again, tossing her notebook onto the coffee table. Guilty as charged. Years of training, I guess. You'd be amazed how much damage control goes into politics. Damage control? He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. What kind of disasters are we talking here? Oh, you know, Jenna said with mock nonchalance, counting on her fingers. Botched press conferences, leaked emails. One time a senator had a full-blown meltdown over the wrong kind of tea being served during a meeting. She shook her head, her smile widening. It's a miracle I didn't lose my mind. Alex chuckled, a low, quiet sound that was warmer than the fire crackling in the corner. And yet, here you are, mediating one of the most contentious debates this village has ever faced. Impressive. Impressive, or masochistic, she teased. Maybe both, he said, his expression softening. They lapsed into a companionable silence for a moment, the weight of their work momentarily forgotten. Jenna reached for the thermos of coffee on the table and poured 2 mugs, sliding one across to Alex. He accepted it with a murmured thanks. What about you? She asked after a sip. What made you decide to poke around in dirt and snow for a living? Alex hesitated, his fingers tightening around the mug. It's not really about the dirt, he said finally. It's about what it tells us. I guess I've always been drawn to the stories no one else notices, the things that get overlooked. Jenna studied him for a long moment, her usual urge to respond with something light-hearted giving way to quiet understanding. That makes sense, she said softly. You're good at seeing things other people don't. Alex looked at her then, his gaze lingering for just a second longer than usual. "So are you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For the first time all night, Jenna didn't have a clever retort. Instead, she smiled, letting the moment settle between them like the snow outside, quiet, unhurried, and strangely perfect. The glow of the laptop's screen flickered against the dark wood-paneled walls of the small office. Victor leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he scanned the report open on the screen. His lips twisted into the faintest smirk. Numbers, projections, charts, clean, objective, and easily bent to interpretation. He'd reviewed Jenna and Alex's preliminary data earlier that evening. Solid work, he'd admit, but everything had a vulnerability. It was just a matter of finding the right angle. Outside, the snowstorm howled, battering the windows, but inside, the room was insulated with an air of quiet calculation. Victor pulled up another document, a dataset he'd requested from one of his own contacts in the regional environmental office. It wasn't perfect, but precision wasn't his goal. Perception was. With a few keystrokes, he began subtly tweaking the figures. A modeled projection of river salinity levels, adjusted upward. A recalculated timeline for vegetation recovery stretched beyond plausible limits. The changes were slight, barely noticeable to the untrained eye, but enough to shift the narrative. It wouldn't disprove Jenna and Alex's findings outright, but it would plant doubt, and doubt, Victor knew, could be as destructive as any outright lie. The printer hummed to life as he sent the altered data to be printed, each page sliding out crisp and authoritative. Victor rose, gathering the sheets, and slipped them into a leather folder. Tomorrow, at the council's informal meeting, he'd offer these as a supplemental perspective. He wouldn't challenge Jenna and Alex directly, not yet. That would only draw suspicion. No, his approach would be quieter, subtler. He'd casually suggest inconsistencies, imply gaps in their methodology, and let the uncertainty fester. The council members, already on edge, would do the rest of the work for him. A knock at the office door startled Victor, though his expression didn't betray it. He glanced at his watch. Late. Too late for anyone to be stopping by. Sliding the folder into a desk drawer, he called out, "Yes?" The door creaked open, revealing Dieter, the hardware store owner. Victor smiled, all polished charm. "Dieter, to what do I owe this late-night visit?" Dieter hesitated in the doorway, his eyes darting to the printer. "Just thought I'd stop by. Heard you were working late again." Victor gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Always working to help this village move forward. Progress takes effort, doesn't it?" Dieter didn't sit. His gaze lingered on the edge of the folder peeking out of the drawer. "It does, but some of us wonder whose progress you're working toward." Victor's smile didn't falter, though his grip on the desk tightened slightly. "I work for what's best for everyone, Dieter. You'll see that soon enough." The air inside the cabin was thick and stifling, despite the hearth crackling in the corner. Jenna leaned over the table, her palm flat against a printed chart, her breath coming faster than she wanted to admit. Across from her, Alex sat with his arms folded tightly, his jaw clenched, his glasses abandoned on the table between them. The lantern cast uneven shadows over his face, deepening the hard line of his expression. "I'm just saying," Jenna said, her voice sharper than intended. "It's strange that these numbers don't match what we recorded last week. I mean, look at the vegetation recovery data." She jabbed a finger at the page. "It's completely off, and you're telling me you didn't touch it?" Alex's brow furrowed, the quiet anger simmering just beneath his composure. "And I'm telling you I didn't. Do you really think I'd falsify data in the middle of an environmental impact study? That I'd sabotage my own work?" "I don't know what to think," Jenna shot back. "But someone made changes. The council's already questioning our methods, and if they see discrepancies like this, it'll undermine everything we've done." Alex stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the worn floorboards. He ran a hand through his dark hair, pacing in the narrow space between the table and the wall. "Maybe you should stop assuming it's my fault. I've been out in the snow every day, gathering samples, running tests. And where have you been? Talking to villagers, trying to win them over like this is some kind of PR campaign." Jenna's eyes widened, the words hitting like a slap. Are you seriously implying I'm not pulling my weight? That I'm just here playing politics? Alex spun to face her, his voice rising. That's exactly what I'm saying. I've been doing the science, Jenna, the actual work. Meanwhile, you're off charming everyone into liking you. Maybe that's why these numbers don't add up, because you're too busy trying to be the hero of this village. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and cutting, and Jenna felt her chest tighten. That's not fair, she said, her voice quieter now but no less fierce. I've been doing my job, building trust, laying the groundwork so that this village actually listens to us when we present our findings. If you think data is all it takes to solve this, you're more naive than I thought. Alex's lips parted, a retort on the tip of his tongue, but he hesitated. For a moment, the tension between them felt like a taut wire, ready to snap. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. This is pointless, he muttered, grabbing his coat from the back of his chair. You do your job, and I'll do mine. At least one of us will stay focused. He pushed the door open, letting in a gust of icy wind and a flurry of snow, and left without another word. Jenna stood motionless, the silence of the cabin pressing in around her. Her hands curled into fists at her sides as frustration and doubt tangled in her chest. She stared down at the table, at the mismatched data, and felt the chill seeping into her bones. For the first time since arriving in the village, the weight of her responsibilities and her partnership with Alex felt impossible to bear. Somewhere outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing footsteps and softening edges, but the divide between them felt as sharp and cold as ever. The fire in the cabin's hearth had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Jenna sat on the floor, her back against the sofa, staring into the smoldering embers. The quiet was heavy, save for the occasional crackle of wood and the howl of wind outside. She wrapped her arms around her knees, her gaze distant, her thoughts tangled. The mismatched data still sat in a neat pile on the table, untouched since Alex had stormed out hours earlier. The door opened with a low creak and a rush of cold air swept in. Jenna didn't look up as Alex stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat and stomping his boots. He hesitated near the threshold before closing the door and leaning against it, his breath visible in the frigid air. I needed some fresh air, he said, his voice rough from the cold, and something else. Jenna didn't respond right away. She shifted slightly, resting her chin on her knees. Did it help? He sighed, moving to sit on the edge of the sofa, just behind her. Not really. Silence stretched between them, brittle and tense. Alex rubbed his hands together, staring down at the floor. Finally, he broke the stillness. I shouldn't have said what I did earlier, he admitted, his voice quieter now. It wasn't fair. Jenna glanced over her shoulder, meeting his eyes. The defensive edge she'd felt all day softened, though the hurt still lingered. You were angry. And I wasn't exactly kind either. Alex leaned forward, bracing his elbows on his knees. It's just, this project, this village, it matters. More than I can explain, and when I saw those discrepancies, I panicked. I thought all the work we'd done, everything we'd been building was falling apart. I lashed out. Jenna turned fully to face him, folding her legs beneath her. I get it, Alex, I do, but you're not the only one who cares about this. I came here because I believe in this village too, and in finding a way to protect it. You said I was just playing politics, but that's not... She stopped, exhaling slowly. That's not who I am. Alex studied her, his expression softening. Then who are you? Jenna hesitated, the question hanging in the air. She looked down at her hands. I used to think I knew, but after years of working in politics, of trying to fix other people's messes, I'm not so sure anymore. I've seen how easily trust can break, how quickly people can turn on each other. I came here hoping to prove, to myself mostly, that compromise is still possible. She met his gaze again. I want to do the right thing, Alex, but I've been scared of letting everyone down, including you. Alex frowned slightly. Let me down, Jenna. You've been holding this whole thing together, talking to the villagers, building bridges. I couldn't do half of what you've done. He paused, his jaw tightening. I'm the one who's difficult. Always have been. I'm used to working alone because it's easier that way. But this, us, it's forced me to let someone in, to actually rely on someone else. That's not easy for me. Jenna tilted her head, her voice softening. Why not? Alex's gaze dropped to the floor. Because I've been burned before, by people I trusted, colleagues, partners. They didn't believe in what I was doing, or in me. So I learned to keep my head down and focus on the work. It's safer that way. Jenna reached out, resting a hand on his arm. The gesture was small but steady. You don't have to do this alone, Alex. Not this time. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. His eyes met hers, searching for something. Doubt, hesitation, but finding none. Slowly he nodded. And I'll try to trust that, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The tension between them eased, replaced by something warmer, more certain. Jenna smiled faintly. So, truce? Alex's lips curved into the smallest of smiles. Truce. For the first time in what felt like days, the air felt lighter. The fire crackled softly, and outside, the wind began to settle. Together, they turned back to the table, the pile of data waiting for them. This time, they'd face it side by side. The council chamber was fuller than usual, the tension palpable as villagers crowded into the wooden benches lining the room. The fire in the hearth blazed, but the icy mood refused to thaw. Jenna stood at the front of the room, her shoulders squared, her notebook clutched in one hand. Beside her, Alex adjusted his glasses, his other hand resting on a stack of papers and maps spread across the table. Across from them, Victor leaned back in his chair, the picture of calm confidence, his leather binder resting neatly before him. Ernst, seated at the head of the council table, cleared his throat. We've reviewed all the reports submitted thus far. However, there remain discrepancies, conflicting projections, diverging conclusions. We brought you here, Jenna and Alex, to clarify these contradictions. Jenna exchanged a brief glance with Alex. He gave a subtle nod, and she stepped forward, her voice steady yet firm. We've uncovered the source of those discrepancies, and it's critical that the council hears this. Victor's smirk faltered slightly, his eyes narrowing as he sat up just a fraction straighter. Alex and I have spent the past several weeks working tirelessly, Jenna continued, her voice carrying across the room. We've cross-referenced data, interviewed villagers, and analyzed patterns. But last week, we found anomalies in the numbers, figures that didn't align with our previous findings. Alex took over, his voice measured but charged with restrained energy. At first, we thought it might be an error on our end, so we revisited every sample, every calculation. But the discrepancies weren't random. They followed a pattern, one designed to undermine the integrity of our conclusions. The room murmured uneasily. Victor's jaw tightened, though his expression remained neutral. Jenna flipped open her notebook, holding it up for the council. We traced the altered data back to a supplemental report submitted by Victor. At first glance, it looked credible, well-documented, professionally formatted. But when cross-checked against the raw data we collected, the numbers didn't hold up. Ernst frowned, his brow furrowed. Are you accusing Victor of falsifying information? It's not an accusation, Alex interjected, stepping forward and spreading a map across the table. It's a fact. Here are river salinity levels from our samples taken over the past month. And here, he pointed to a corresponding chart from Victor's report, his finger tapping sharply against the page, are the altered projections. Notice how his numbers contradict not only ours, but the environmental trends observed in this region for decades? These aren't errors. They're deliberate manipulations. The murmurs turned into a low buzz, disbelief rippling through the room. Victor's calm facade cracked, his lips pressing into a thin line. This is a baseless claim, he said smoothly, though his voice carried a faint edge. I submitted my findings in good faith, based on external sources. Alex didn't waver. We contacted those sources, he said, his tone cutting. They confirmed they provided no such projections. You fabricated the data, Victor. Gasps filled the chamber. Victor opened his mouth to respond, but Jenna cut him off, her voice rising. What's worse, this wasn't just an attempt to discredit us. It was an attempt to sway the council toward approving the development project without fully understanding the environmental consequences. If you succeed, the cost to this village, this land, will be irreversible. The villagers erupted in whispers, anger mingling with shock. Ernst raised a hand to quiet the crowd, his expression grave. Victor, he said, his voice like thunder, do you deny these accusations? Victor hesitated, his carefully crafted mask slipping. Then he gave a tight, forced smile. I was only trying to provide a different perspective. A false perspective, Jenna interrupted, her voice ringing with conviction. One that serves your interests, not the village's. The silence that followed was deafening. Ernst leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. We'll discuss the ramifications of this later. For now, Jenna, Alex, please proceed with your findings. Jenna looked to Alex, and for the first time in weeks, the weight on her chest lifted. They had protected their work, their integrity intact. Alex's lips curved in the faintest of smiles, one she returned as they turned back to the table, recommitted to their shared mission. Together, they would see this through. The village square was unrecognizable, transformed into a vibrant hub of celebration. Strings of warm lights crisscrossed between timbered rooftops, casting a golden glow on the snow-covered cobblestones. Children's laughter rang out as they chased one another around a snowman adorned with a brightly knit scarf. The air smelled of roasted chestnuts and spiced cider, mingling with the faint, earthy scent of wood smoke. Jenna stood off to the side, near the edge of the square, watching as the villagers moved through the snowfall, their faces alight with rare, unguarded joy. It's strange, isn't it? Alex's quiet voice came from beside her. She turned to find him standing there, hands buried in his coat pockets, his scarf still askew. His breath curled like smoke in the crisp air. Seeing everyone like this, like the weight's finally been lifted. Jenna smiled faintly, her arms crossed against the chill. Strange but good, she said. They deserve this. A chance to celebrate something that feels right. The council meeting earlier that day still lingered vividly in her mind. After weeks of tension, debate, and uncertainty, the council had finally reached a decision. Ernst had announced it with a voice thick with emotion. The development project would move forward, but only under strict guidelines to protect the land. Limited expansion, sustainable practices, a commitment to preserving the village's history and natural beauty. It wasn't a perfect solution, there never was one, but it was balanced, thoughtful. It was enough. Jenna glanced at Alex, catching the way the firelight played in the depths of his eyes. You know, we actually did it, she said softly, the words almost disbelieving. Against all odds. Alex's lips quirked into the faintest of smiles. We did. Though I'll admit, I didn't expect it to end with mulled wine and snowball fights. Jenna laughed, a sound that felt freer than it had in weeks. Maybe that's how it should end, with a reminder of what they're protecting. A small group of villagers approached them then, offering warm thanks that felt as genuine as the smiles on their faces. Jenna and Alex nodded graciously, exchanging a glance as the group moved on. Looks like we're not the outsiders anymore, Jenna murmured. Maybe, Alex replied, his voice quiet but steady. But I think I'm okay with that. As more snow began to fall, soft and unhurried, Jenna and Alex stood together, letting themselves be a part of the warmth and celebration. The snow crunched softly underfoot as Jenna and Alex climbed the gentle slope above the village, the moonlight spilling across the landscape in a silvery glow. The village below was quiet now, the celebration a distant memory, its golden lights winking through the mist. In the crisp, still air, the only sounds were their footsteps and the faint rustle of the wind through the ancient trees that crowned the hill. Jenna carried a small wooden box under one arm, her gloved fingers gripping it tightly. Inside were the mementos they had gathered, maps marked with their routes, sketches Alex had made of soil samples, a wrinkled page from Jenna's notebook filled with hurried late-night ideas. A photograph Ernst had taken of them, mid-laughter, was tucked on top. It wasn't much, but it felt like everything, a testament to the journey they'd shared and the challenges they had overcome. Are you sure it's here? Jenna asked, her breath visible in the cold as she glanced at Alex. He nodded, pointing ahead. Just there, under that tree. The tree stood alone at the edge of the hill, its gnarled branches twisting skyward, as if reaching for something unseen. Snow clung to its bark, but its roots were ancient and strong, gripping the earth like an anchor. It felt timeless, a perfect place for what they had planned. Alex dropped the small spade he'd been carrying, kneeling to clear a patch of snow near the base of the tree. Jenna crouched beside him, placing the box gently on the ground while he worked. The silence between them was comfortable now. no longer fraught with misunderstandings or unspoken doubts. It was a silence that spoke of trust, of companionship, of something deeper. When the hole was ready, Alex sat back on his heels, brushing snow from his gloves. Jenna placed the box carefully into the earth, pausing for a moment as if to consider the weight of what they were leaving behind. "We'll come back someday," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the wind. "And when we do, we'll remember all of this." Alex nodded, his eyes meeting hers in the pale moonlight. "We will," he said. "No matter how much changes, this will always be here." Together, they covered the box, smoothing the snow over the disturbed ground until it looked untouched again. Jenna sat back with a sigh, leaning her shoulder against Alex's. He didn't move away. For a long moment, they stayed like that, looking out over the snow-covered village below, the echoes of their journey settling into the earth and their hearts. The train platform was quiet, save for the muffled crunch of footsteps on snow and the distant whistle of the approaching train. Jenna stood at the edge, her breath curling into the crisp morning air as she looked out over the village, its rooftops dusted in silver under the pale dawn light. The stillness felt heavy, like an ending she wasn't quite ready for. Alex stood a step behind her, his hands buried in his coat pockets, his scarf still slightly askew. "You'll come back," he said softly, his voice low but certain. "We'll come back." Jenna turned to him, her eyes meeting his. There was no hesitation in his gaze, no guarded walls, just quiet, steady assurance. She smiled, bittersweet and warm, the kind of smile that holds more than words can say. "We will," she murmured, "together." The train whistle grew louder, its call cutting through the silence, but neither of them moved. Alex reached for her hand, tucking it into his gloved one, and they stood like that, grounded in the moment. Around them the snow began to fall, soft and unhurried, like a promise whispered to the mountains. "Until then," Jenna said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "Until then," Alex echoed.